Anxiety is an interesting thing. Philosophers, particularly people like Soren Kierkegaard, saw anxiety as a critical part of being human. It is what motivates us to do better, to be more human, and encourages us to do great works, to get up and care for ourselves, to engage the world. And yet anxiety can be so very destructive when it is dysfunctional and not connected with the reality of life. Within the danger distance system, or the model for understanding depression and anxiety, the danger distance system, it views anxiety disorders as being a broken, maladaptive system of what is a very critical role within life. That is, we need fear to survive. The problem is when fear becomes so pervasive that it becomes a dysfunctional anxiety. And so there really can be a difference between fear and anxiety in the clinical sense. Although we often use the terms interchangeably, for the purposes of caring for a child, their meanings are distinct. Fear generally refers to a response to a current danger, something that's tangible. It's adaptive. It facilitates survival. It's realistic. It occurs in relation to an actual threat. And it's oriented toward the present. It's immediate with the current environment. So fear is an expected response when confronted, for example, with a dog that's growling and baring its teeth. In comparison, anxiety is a negative emotional state characterized by worry, fear, and bodily reactions related to thoughts of an actual or potential event, object, or situation. Thus, anxiety is typically oriented toward the future and is generally considered to be an unreasonable or excessive emotional reaction because it occurs in the absence of any immediate severe threat. For example, anxiety is the worry and distress someone experiences before they even leave the house, because the person thinks that they might encounter a growling dog on the way to school. Although some level of anxiety is expected in particular situations, like speaking in class, etc., and it might occasionally motivate productive action, high levels of anxiety will interfere with social and occupational functioning, and chronically high will cause severe disruptions within life. And so anxiety can be defined as an unpleasant tension state. It resembles fear in certain circumstances, but need not be associated with a specific stimulus, and perhaps not even an external realistic event. So, I hope you see there that we can already make some assumptions as to what might work for treatment based upon that and based upon our previous week's lecture. Now, according to the psychological perspective, disorders in the anxiety disorders category are characterized by motor tension, hyperactivity, apprehensive thoughts, and fearful expectations. And they affect the domains of the physical, so there's feelings of nausea, dizziness, increased heart rate, dimension of the cognitive, so thoughts of being hurt, difficulty concentrating or a sense of uncontrollability, and the behavioral side, so things like crying or screaming or fidgeting or being immobilized or avoidance behaviors. And when it comes to the DSM, we're really going to look at 2, maybe 3 related symptoms. One is anxiety disorders, and along with that I will include panic attacks. But then there's also obsessive-compulsive and related disorders, which is different but related. They all draw from the same symptoms and the same system. Anxiety disorders are typified by the internalized sense of fear and avoidance and thoughts. The obsessive-compulsive consists of an anxiety about something and excessive checking. And the panic attack aspect really includes a intense, discrete period of time of extreme and intense apprehension, fearfulness, terror, and a feeling of overwhelming disaster, often characterized as fear of fear, or the fear of the expectation of panic attacks. Now, when we look at anxiety disorders, there are a lot of different aspects that we can take a look at, particularly with children. One of them is separation anxiety disorder, and this is characterized by intense fear or anxiety in relation to actual or anticipated separation from significant others. And although in a healthy attachment relationship, it might be expected that children would exhibit some distress upon being separated from important caregivers, the degree of fear or anxiety is developmentally inappropriate. So most of their peers don't exhibit similar symptoms. And it's associated with persistent thoughts that some harm will come to their caregiver or themselves. There's nightmares. There's physical symptoms of distress like headaches or even vomiting. And separation anxiety disorder is really often observed in early preschool years and in middle childhood. And although onset on occasion can develop in adolescence and continue into adulthood, it usually expresses itself earlier in childhood. And so there's an avoidance of separation from caregivers, and this will result in clinging behaviors, refusing to leave the attached figure's side. This can result in missing school and experiencing disruptions in developmentally expected activities like playing with their peers, like exploring the environment. There can also be anxiety of selective mutism. And developmentally, children speak more frequently as they acquire language skills, but selective mutism is associated with a failure to speak in specific social situations in which one is expected to speak, even though the individual speaks fluently in other situations. For example, a child might speak or meet social expectations at home with parents, but will fail to respond to communications from peers or teachers at school. And as you might expect, this can result in some significant impairments in social relationships as well as academic achievements, as well as in later life in occupational settings, as, for example, a child might, or an adolescent might, fail to engage in social activities that require some interaction. There can also be specific phobias. And a specific phobia is defined by impairing anxiety that is related to a specific object or situation. So there's an extreme fear associated with the object or situation, and that results in avoidance of what is feared, which in turn typically results in that greater disturbance in functioning. For example, if someone has a phobia of spiders, that child may refuse to leave the house or to play outside or play in the playground for fear of the spider or of fear of interacting with a spider. When it comes to panic disorder, this is pretty straightforward, and I have mentioned a little bit about it already. It is the incidence of repeated and expected or unexpected panic attacks accompanied by at least 1 month of continuous concerns about the occurrence of another panic attack and related consequences. So it isn't just one panic attack and you can be diagnosed like this. It takes some time. Those diagnosed with this disorder may experience expected or unexpected attacks. And in the event of expected attacks, the cue or trigger may be something external. So, for example, a crowded bus, or internal, their heart racing after they run for the bus. And that sensation can cause the panic attack. There's also feelings of agoraphobia, and agoraphobia literally means fear of the marketplace, and it's normally associated with fear of leaving one's home. Agoraphobia is associated with worry about and avoidance of situations that individuals fear they'll be unable to escape should they experience a panic attack or some related negative symptoms. Agoraphobia typically develops when an individual experiences an attack in a particular situation and consequently experiences anxiety when exposed to a similar situation or the thoughts of a similar situation. There's also generalized anxiety disorder, and that's a very descriptive term. It's characterized by intense anxiety and worry about a variety of events or activities. And this anxiety occurs for more days than not for at least 6 months. And a central feature of this disorder is that individuals find it difficult to control their worry, which occurs together with symptoms of restlessness, fatigue, irritability, sleep disturbances, muscle tension, and or difficulty concentrating. In order for this diagnosis to be applied, these symptoms must create significant impairment in daily functioning. And we should realize that generalized anxiety disorder is the most common of anxiety disorders identified within children. Although I do have some neuroscience colleagues that specialize in anxiety disorders that argue that generalized anxiety disorder itself does not exist, but is really just a catch-all for clinicians that are lazy in their diagnosis. Be that as it may, as it stands, generalized anxiety disorder is the most common. Then there is obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. Now, obsessive-compulsive disorder here is a clinical disorder, not a personality disorder. So we're not talking about obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which is different from obsessive-compulsive disorder as an anxiety disorder or anxiety-related disorder. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is characterized by obsessions. So thinking, which is the result of considerable distress and anxiety, and compulsions, which function to decrease that anxiety. For example, the obsession of feeling dirty, of having dirty hands. And that results in a compulsion of washing your hands every 5 minutes. And the negative consequence of that is you eventually rub all the skin off of your hands. That type of thing. So an obsession is a persistent, recurrent, and intrusive thought that can include images. So, for example, throwing a pet in a fire, or ideas, a fear that parents will be hurt. And typically these cognitions are focused on unrealistic events, are excessive and irrational, and result in significant distress and fear. And although the individual usually recognizes the illogical nature of the obsession, although this can be less common in children, the individual is unable to decrease the occurrence of the thought or associated fear. And the most common obsessions in children and youth include thoughts of contamination, of something being wrong with a body part, of being obsessed with the harm of themselves or of someone else, or being concerned with specific order and symmetry. Now, in order to reduce the distress and anxiety associated with an obsession, the individual engages in one or more compulsions, which refer to repetitive, purposeful, and intentional behaviors like hand washing, or mental acts like counting to 100 by twos silently. Typically, these actions are time-consuming, and they can oftentimes take an hour or more per day. And they're recognized by the individual often as being excessive or unreasonable, and they themselves recognize the distress that they cause. Now, the thing to be mindful of here is there is this relationship between the obsession and the compulsion. The obsessional thought creates anxiety and distress, and the compulsive act serves to decrease this distress. So we need to be mindful that both are present. Now, when we recognize that these various issues go together, and that there is that underlying system of fear and danger, we can see that a clear treatment for these disorders is an SSRI, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that calms down that distressing system. But it isn't just that we have these couple of disorders. There's also excoriation disorders. So excoriation, which literally means skin picking, is associated with repeating picking of one's skin, resulting in skin wounds. And this is also associated with something called trichotillomania. And that's related with obsessive-compulsive and related disorders as well. And it's associated with repetitive acts of pulling out one's own hair, plucking out one's hair, one's eyebrows, one's body hairs. And this often leads to hair loss. And there's significant distress results from the recurrent behavior, including feelings of shame and embarrassment and avoidance of social interactions in which the hair loss may be observed. But the pulling of the hair can bring a feeling of relief from the emotional pain that causes it, as with excoriation. disorders, skin-picking disorders. So there's a lot of difficulties and challenges that go with anxiety disorders when working with children. In his book, The Worried Child, by Paul Foxman, he distinguishes between fear and anxiety, and fright and stress, whereby fear is an instinctive reaction to a clear and present threat. Anxiety is a state of apprehension or worry about a danger or threat that might occur. Fright is a state of fear when danger or threat catches us by surprise. And stress is any situation, positive or negative, that requires adjustment or change. And Foxman suggests that anxiety, the fear reactions triggered by the possibility of danger where none exists, can be explained to children by asking them to imagine being a small animal, such as a mouse, living in nature where there are predators. When the mouse is threatened, it senses danger and hides. When all is safe, the mouse relaxes and resumes normal activities. But if the mouse can't relax, we'd say that it suffers from anxiety, because the immediate threat and danger has passed. As Foxman says, in children, dangers and threats consist of anything that jeopardizes emotional security and physical dependency. They can include sexual or physical abuse, witnessing violence, divorce of parents, being bullied, losing a parent, injury or serious illness, and other stresses. The high rate of such stresses and threats facing today's children is the main reason why anxiety disorders have become so prevalent. And so I think all child and youth care workers need to have a sense that danger plays a huge role. In certain crisis circumstances, the stress level can cause a significant increase in reported anxiety levels. For example, following Hurricane Katrina, it was reported that between 25 and 55% of children and youth in Louisiana experienced serious emotional difficulties. We also need to help children to interpret external events, to have a positive, rational sense of what reality is like. It's also important to help children develop a sense of control. A child's anxiety and depression correlate significantly with their sense of control over their own destinies. Allowing children to make decisions and helping to guide them in making decisions is an important way of alleviating the development of anxiety. Simply telling children what to do is a great way to facilitate and control a child, facilitate the development of anxiety. But helping a child to develop an internal locus of control will go a long ways to become more resilient against anxious and depressed situations. By contrast, if the child believes they are victims of circumstance, so they have an external locus of control, they will likely be susceptible to the development of an anxiety or depression. It's also important to have freedom to play. Play and freedom to play and to explore and to be independent and to make choices under guidance and direction go a long way to helping a child to discover their own internal locus of control that will help to inoculate them to development of anxiety. And then finally, the ability to interpret situations and attribute positive emotions to experiences also brings strength to the child and to the individual. So again, cognitive behavioral therapy goes a long way to dealing with anxiety disorders as well as obsessive-compulsive disorders. And just like depression,